April 18th, 1943, 6:30 a.m., Henderson Field, Guadalcanal. 18 P-38 Lightning fighters sit in formation on a muddy runway, their twin fuselages glistening with morning dew. The tropical air hangs thick with humidity and the sharp smell of high-octane aviation fuel. It's that strange hour before dawn when the world exists in shades of gray, when you can barely make out the faces of the men standing beside you. These aren't hardened veterans. Look at them closely. Tom Lanfear just turned 24 3 weeks ago. Rex Barber celebrated his 23rd birthday last month. Besby Holmes is 22. These are college kids, really. Kids who should be finishing term papers or going to football games. Instead, they're about to fly a suicide mission into the heart of Japanese-controlled airspace. Major John Mitchell stands before them in the pre-dawn darkness, his flight briefing illuminated by flashlights. "Gentlemen, we're going after a VIP." That's it. That's all they get. The pilots exchange nervous glances. What kind of VIP is worth risking 18 fighters on a 435-mile round trip through enemy territory? What kind of target justifies strapping oversized fuel tanks to their aircraft that will make them sitting ducks if they encounter Japanese fighters? They don't know. They can't know. But 435 miles away, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto is eating his final breakfast. Here's what makes this story so extraordinary, so deeply tragic that it haunts military historians to this day. The man these American pilots are about to kill isn't just any Japanese commander. He's the architect of Pearl Harbor, the name Americans curse with every breath, the face on every wanted poster, the man whose death would be considered the greatest victory of 1943. But Admiral Yamamoto never wanted this war. Let me take you back to 1920, Harvard University, Massachusetts. A young Japanese naval officer named Isoroku Yamamoto walks across Harvard Yard, his books tucked under his arm. He's 26 years old, studying economics and petroleum, completely fascinated by this enormous country he's found himself in. Picture him in those Harvard classrooms, learning about American industrial capacity. Watch him travel to Texas, touring oil fields that stretch to the horizon. See him at poker tables with American students, learning the game that will become his lifelong passion. He's not gathering intelligence, he's genuinely trying to understand this place. And what he sees terrifies him. The numbers don't lie. By 1920, America produces 64% of the world's oil. American steel production dwarfs Japan's by a factor of 12 to 1. The industrial capacity Yamamoto witnesses isn't just impressive, it's overwhelming, it's impossible. So when he returns to Japan and his superiors start discussing war with America, Yamamoto's response is chilling. "I can run wild for 6 months. Perhaps a year, but after that, I have utterly no confidence." Think about that for a moment. The man who will plan Pearl Harbor is telling his government that Japan cannot win this war. He's not being modest, he's not playing political games. He's stating a mathematical certainty based on everything he's seen. But here's the thing about duty. Here's the thing about honor in the Japanese military system of the 1940s. When the emperor's government decides on war, you don't get to say no. You don't get to resign. You plan the attack you believe will fail. You execute the strategy you know will doom your country. And that's exactly what Yamamoto does. December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor. Yamamoto's carriers launch their attack exactly as planned. The operation is a tactical masterpiece. American battleships burn, over 2,400 Americans die. Japan achieves complete surprise. But Yamamoto doesn't celebrate. His staff finds him withdrawn, almost depressed. Why? Because he knows what's coming. He's just awakened a sleeping giant, and he's calculated exactly how many months Japan has before that giant crushes them. 6 months, maybe a year. Now, on April 18, 1943, exactly 16 months after Pearl Harbor, his prediction is about to come true in the most personal way imaginable. This mission almost didn't happen. The story begins 2,400 miles away from Pearl Harbor. This isn't some Hollywood movie set with blinking computers. We're talking about 1943. These are manual typewriters, carbon paper, and human brains working themselves to exhaustion. The Navy's code-breaking unit, Station Hypo, has been fighting a war in shadows. For months, they've been chipping away at Japan's JN-25 naval code, the communication system that coordinates their entire Pacific fleet. Every intercepted message is another piece of a massive puzzle. Then, on April 13th, 5 days before our mission, they intercept something different, something explosive. The message details an inspection tour. Admiral Yamamoto will be visiting forward bases in the Solomon Islands. But here's what makes every cryptanalyst's heart race. The message includes exact times, specific locations, even the aircraft identification numbers. It's his complete itinerary down to the minute. Commander Edwin Layton can barely believe what he's reading. The Japanese have just handed them Yamamoto's exact schedule. It's like the enemy boxing champion texting you his training schedule and asking you to stop by. Layton rushes to Admiral Nimitz's office. The conversation that follows will change naval warfare forever. "We know where Yamamoto will be on April 18th. We can intercept him," Layton says. Nimitz doesn't hesitate. Do it. But there's a problem, a massive problem that threatens the entire operation. If they shoot down Yamamoto, the Japanese will know their codes are broken. They'll change everything overnight. The entire intelligence advantage the Americans had been building for months will vanish. The entire code-breaking operation, thousands of hours of work, will be worthless. So the question becomes, is killing one admiral worth losing your ability to read the enemy's mail for the rest of the war? Nimitz makes the call. Kill Yamamoto. The psychological impact on Japan will be worth more than any tactical intelligence. But they need to make it look like luck, like random chance, like an unfortunate encounter rather than a planned assassination. That's where the P-38 Lightnings come in. Major John Mitchell looks at the map and does the math. And the math is brutal. Yamamoto will be flying from Rabaul to Balalay Airfield on Bougainville Island. The intercept point is 435 miles from Guadalcanal. Round trip, 870 miles. The P-38 Lightning's combat radius, about 400 miles on a good day. They need to fly 435 miles just to reach the target, then fight, then fly 435 miles back, with 1943 navigation equipment, over open ocean, at wave-top height to avoid Japanese radar. It's mathematically impossible. Unless they strap an extra fuel tank to every P-38. Not the standard drop tanks, those won't be enough. They need the massive 330-gallon tanks, the ones that haven't even been tested in combat, the ones that will make the nimble Lightning fighters handle like pregnant whales. Oh, and there's another problem. They have exactly 12 of these experimental tanks on Guadalcanal. They need 18. Cue the most frantic logistics operation of the Pacific War. 6 more tanks are flown in from Port Moresby, New Guinea. Mechanics work through the night fitting them to aircraft never designed to carry this much weight. Engineers run calculations and recalculations on fuel consumption rates. The final numbers are terrifying. Each pilot will have approximately 15 minutes of fuel reserve when they return to Guadalcanal. 15 minutes. If they encounter headwinds, if they have to fight longer than expected, if they get lost, even slightly, they're swimming. But wait, it gets worse. They can't fly high. Japanese radar stations dot the Solomon Islands. If the Americans fly at normal altitude, they'll be spotted 200 miles out. The entire mission will fail before it begins. So they'll fly at 50 feet. 50 feet above the Pacific Ocean for over 2 hours. At 50 feet, one moment of inattention means cartwheeling into the ocean at 300 miles per hour. At 50 feet, there's no margin for error, no time to react if something goes wrong.
Mitchell selects his pilots carefully. This isn't a mission for glory hounds or cowboys. He needs men who can hold formation for hours in brutal conditions, men who can navigate using nothing but compass, clock, and dead reckoning, men who won't panic when everything goes wrong. And on a mission like this, everything will go wrong. The mission plan is elegantly simple in concept, nightmarishly complex in execution. 18 P-38s will take off at exactly 7:10 a.m. They'll fly in 4-plane divisions, stacked in formation. The killer group, 4 P-38s, led by Captain Tom Lanphier, will go after the bombers. The remaining 14 aircraft, led by Mitchell, will run interference against any Japanese fighter escorts. They'll maintain radio silence the entire way. No chatter, no calls. Just the roar of twin Allison engines and the hope that your navigation calculations are correct. The intercept point is over Bougainville Island at 9:35 a.m., not 9:30, not 9:40. Yamamoto's transport runs on Japanese naval precision. If the Americans are late, they miss him. If they're early, they circle and burn precious fuel while Japanese fighters scramble. They need to arrive at exactly 9:35 a.m. after a 435-mile flight at wavetop height with 1943 technology. It's the most technically demanding navigation mission ever attempted in the Pacific War, and they're giving it to kids barely out of college. April 18, 1943. Guadalcanal Airfield, New Britain, 5:30 a.m. Admiral Yamamoto wakes early, as always. At 59, he's methodical about his routines, the meditation, the exercise, the careful attention to his dress uniform. Everything is precise. Everything is proper. His staff is nervous. The signs are everywhere. His aide, Captain Watanabe, approaches him during breakfast. "Admiral, perhaps we should delay the inspection tour. American fighters have been active in the area." Yamamoto barely looks up from his meal. The schedule stands. General Imamura, commander of the 8th Area Army, tries a different approach. "Sir, I was nearly shot down by American fighters just last week over Bougainville. The route isn't safe." Yamamoto's response is cold. "If the route isn't safe for me, how can I ask my men to fly it daily?" Vice Admiral Ozawa makes one final attempt. "At least let me provide a massive fighter escort, 20 or 30 Zeros, enough to guarantee your safety." But Yamamoto refuses. Why? Because 20 Zeros appearing suddenly over Bougainville would alert every American intelligence operator in the South Pacific. Because showing fear would devastate the morale of men already losing battles across the Pacific. So the 59-year-old admiral climbs into the lead Betty bomber carrying only his samurai sword, his briefcase, and a poem he's written. The poem sits in his personal safe back at Truk. His staff will find it weeks later when they're going through his effects. The final lines are prophetic. "The body is frail, but the spirit lives on. Though I die on distant shores, my loyalty remains eternal." 2 Betty bombers taxi to the runway. 6 Zero fighters warm up their engines, preparing to escort the most valuable man in the Japanese Empire through 300 miles of increasingly hostile airspace. Yamamoto settles into his seat. The flight is scheduled to take exactly 1 hour and 10 minutes. They'll land at Balile Airfield at 9:45 a.m. Tour the base, inspect the garrison, boost morale. The Admiral doesn't know that American cryptanalysts have read his entire schedule. He doesn't know that 18 P-38 Lightnings left Guadalcanal 45 minutes ago. He doesn't know that his precise adherence to schedule, that very Japanese attention to punctuality, is about to kill him. At 8:30 a.m., his Betty bomber lifts off from Rabaul. Formation perfect. Course plotted. Arrival time, 9:45 a.m. They're flying to their deaths with mechanical precision.
7:10 a.m., Henderson Field, Guadalcanal. Tom Lanphier guns his engines and races down the muddy runway. Behind him, 17 other P-38s thunder into the air, each carrying fuel loads that make them dangerously tail-heavy. The experimental 330-gallon drop tanks hang beneath their bellies like pregnant pods. Rex Barber, flying wing to Lanphier, fights his controls as his Lightning wallows through the humid air. The P-38 is supposed to be nimble, responsive. With these fuel loads, it feels like flying a school bus. Major Mitchell checks his watch and establishes course, 290 degrees, due northwest. They drop to 50 feet above the water and settle into formation. Now comes the hard part, the waiting. Imagine what these pilots are experiencing. For over 2 hours, nothing but the roar of engines, the vibration through your seat, the endless blue of the Pacific passing beneath at 300 miles per hour. You can't relax. At 50 feet, one moment of inattention means death. Your neck aches from constantly scanning for Japanese fighters. Your eyes burn from the glare off the water. The cockpit temperature climbs above 110 degrees. You're soaked in sweat, breathing oxygen that tastes like rubber, and every minute that passes burns fuel you'll desperately need for the flight home. And you have no idea if you're even going to the right place. 1 degree off course over 435 miles means missing the target by 7 miles. 7 miles over open ocean might as well be 7,000. There's no GPS, no satellite navigation, just compass, airspeed, wind correction, and hope that Mitchell's calculations are correct. At 9:50 a.m., trouble. Lieutenant Joe Moore's P-38 develops a mechanical problem. His auxiliary fuel tank won't release. The tank is empty, turning his fighter into a flying brick. Moore tries everything, hitting the release multiple times, violent maneuvers to shake it loose. Nothing works. His wingman, Lieutenant James McClanahan, follows him out of formation. 2 fighters down before they even reach the target. Mitchell watches them go and checks his fuel gauge. They're burning through reserves faster than calculated. He does the math in his head and realizes they're cutting it dangerously close. At 9:33 a.m., 2 minutes before the scheduled intercept, the western coast of Bougainville Island appears on the horizon. Mitchell checks his watch. They're 3 minutes early. 3 minutes early after a 435-mile flight using 1943 navigation equipment. It's perhaps the most impressive feat of aerial navigation in the Pacific War, and Mitchell has about 5 seconds to feel proud before everything goes to hell. 9:34 a.m., Bougainville Island. Doug Canning, flying high cover, spots them first. 2 bombers with 6-0 escorts, exactly where the intelligence said they'd be, exactly when they said they'd be there. Bogies, 11 o'clock high. Mitchell's voice cuts through the radio. Killer flight, take the bombers. Everybody else, get those zeros. But there's immediate confusion. The intelligence briefing said 1 Betty bomber. They're looking at 2. Which one carries Yamamoto? Tom Lanphier doesn't hesitate. He picks the lead bomber and dives, his wingman Rex Barber close behind. Behind them, Besby Holmes and Ray Hine follow, but Holmes is still fighting with his stuck drop tank. The Japanese formation is at 6,500 feet, about 4 miles away. The P-38s are at 50 feet. They'll have to climb almost straight up, burning speed and fuel, making themselves perfect targets for the Zero escorts.
Inside the lead Betty bomber, Admiral Yamamoto stares out the window at Bougainville's jungle canopy passing below. In exactly 11 minutes, they'll land at Balalay. The inspection tour will begin, another day of duty, another day of a war he knows cannot be won. He doesn't see the P-38s climbing toward him like vengeful angels. But the Zero pilots do. They dive immediately. 6 Imperial Navy fighters with some of the best pilots in the Pacific. But they've made a crucial mistake. They were flying loose escort, not tight formation. They're too far from the bombers to intercept in time.
Lanfear's P-38 shudders as he pushes the throttles to full power. The twin Allison engines howl, clawing for altitude. He's gaining, but the Zeros are gaining faster. In seconds, they'll be in firing range. Rex Barber, flying Lanfear's wing, suddenly finds himself separated. In the chaos of the climb, formation discipline has shattered. Now it's every man for himself. Barber spots the lead Betty bomber and makes a split-second decision. Instead of following Lanfear, he goes for a head-on pass at the bomber. It's textbook P-38 tactics. Use your heavy nose armament to tear apart the lightly armored Betty before it can respond. The engagement happens in seconds, but each second contains lifetimes. Barber's 4.5 caliber machine guns and single 20mm cannon erupt. From 500 yards out, he walks his fire into the Betty's fuselage. The 20mm shells, each one the size of a fist, punch through the bomber's thin aluminum skin like it's tissue paper. Inside the bomber, chaos. The aircraft shudders. Smoke fills the cabin. The pilot fights the controls as hydraulic fluid sprays across the cockpit. Admiral Yamamoto, seated in the passenger cabin, has approximately 3 seconds to process what's happening. 3 seconds to realize that his prediction, 6 months, perhaps a year, has finally come true. 3 seconds to understand that the war he never wanted has finally reached him personally. 2 20mm cannon shells hit him. 1 in the left jaw, 1 in the left shoulder blade. The autopsy will later show both wounds were instantly fatal. The Betty bomber doesn't explode. It doesn't cartwheel. It simply loses all power and begins a slow, almost graceful descent into the jungle canopy below. Meanwhile, Lanfear is fighting for his life. 3 Zeros converge on him, their 20mm cannons spitting fire. Lanfear throws his P-38 into a violent barrel roll, the maneuvering so extreme he nearly blacks out. He spots what he thinks is a Betty bomber through the chaos and fires a burst, seeing strikes along its fuselage. In the decades to come, Lanfear will claim this as his kill shot. He'll describe watching Yamamoto's bomber trail smoke and crash. He'll give detailed interviews about the moment he killed Japan's greatest admiral. But Rex Barber's aircraft will land with 104 bullet holes. Lanfear's returns untouched. The second Betty bomber, carrying Chief of Staff Admiral Matome Ugaki and 11 other staff officers, attempt to escape. The pilot, seeing his commander's aircraft spiraling into the jungle, shoves the throttles forward and dives for the water. He doesn't make it. American fighters swarm the bomber. The Betty takes hit after hit. Engine streaming smoke, parts flying off in the slipstream. The pilot manages to ditch in shallow water just offshore, but the impact is catastrophic. The Betty hits at over 200 miles per hour, disintegrating on impact. Admiral Ugaki survives, barely. He floats in the Pacific, watching black smoke rise from the jungle where his closest friend, his commander, his mentor, has just died. In his diary, he'll write, "I grabbed the shoulder of the Air Staff Officer Muroy, pointed to the first aircraft and said, 'Look at the Commander-in-Chief's plane.' This became my parting with him forever." The entire engagement lasts 15 minutes. 15 minutes to change the Pacific War. Now the Americans have a different problem. They need to get home, and they're almost out of fuel. Mitchell's voice crackles over the radio. "Everybody out! Head for home!" The P-38s dive back to wave-top height and turn southeast. Every pilot immediately checks their fuel gauge and does the math. The math is not good.
They've just fought at full throttle for 15 minutes. Combat power burns fuel at twice the normal rate. Those reserve tanks that were supposed to give them 15 minutes of margin? Gone. Lieutenant Raymond Hine never makes it. His fuel exhausted, his engines sputter and die 50 miles from Guadalcanal. He ditches in the Pacific and is never seen again. Rex Barber lands at Henderson Field with his fuel gauge reading empty. Mechanics will later drain his tanks and measure exactly 11 gallons remaining, about 4 minutes of flight time. But the true cost of the mission won't be measured in fuel or bullet holes. When the pilots gather for debriefing, Tom Lanphier is adamant. "I got him. I shot down the lead bomber." Rex Barber is equally certain. "I hit the lead bomber head-on. It was my fire that brought it down." Intelligence officer John Mitchell has a problem. 2 pilots claiming the same kill. Both absolutely convinced. Both with details that match their perspective of the chaotic engagement. Mitchell makes a decision that will haunt these men for the rest of their lives. He credits both pilots with a half kill each. It's a compromise. It's also gasoline on a fire that will burn for 48 years. But the biggest question remains unanswered. Did they actually kill anyone important? The mission was classified at the highest level. None of the pilots knew they were hunting Yamamoto. Intelligence officers debriefed them separately, carefully avoiding any confirmation of the target's identity. For 3 weeks, the Americans wait. Japanese radio traffic gives no indication of anything unusual. No increase in coded messages, no emergency communications. Nothing. Maybe they just shot down a regular transport. Maybe the VIP wasn't on board. Maybe the entire mission was for nothing. Then, on May 21, 1943, Tokyo Radio broadcasts a special announcement. The entire nation is ordered to observe 1 minute of silence. Emperor Hirohito himself issues a statement. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor, commander of the combined fleet, is dead, killed in action over Bougainville on April 18, 1943. The American pilots suddenly understand what they've accomplished. They've killed the Japanese equivalent of Eisenhower, Patton, and MacArthur combined, the most revered military figure in Japan. And it breaks them in ways none of them expect. Here's where this story becomes truly tragic, where the cost of those 15 minutes extends across decades. Tom Lanphier immediately begins telling his story. He gives interviews to war correspondents. He describes in vivid detail the moment he shot down Yamamoto's bomber. His account is compelling, dramatic, filled with the kind of details that make great journalism. By 1945, Lanphier is famous. Magazine articles feature him as the pilot who killed Yamamoto. He's invited to speak at military gatherings. He writes his own accounts of the mission. He becomes essentially the public face of Operation Vengeance. Rex Barber says nothing. For years, he stays quiet, following the military tradition of not seeking personal glory. He knows what happened. His aircraft came back with 104 bullet holes. He fired his guns at the lead bomber. He watched it trail smoke into the jungle. But Lanphier has the media. Lanphier has the story. The tension builds through the 1950s and 60s. At reunions, the 2 men barely speak. Other pilots from the mission start taking sides. Detailed analyses of the engagement are written and rewritten. Every shred of evidence is examined, debated, argued over. In 1973, Lanphier publishes "I Shot Down Yamamoto" in Reader's Digest. It's read by millions. It becomes the accepted version of events. Rex Barber finally breaks his silence, writing letters to aviation historians, presenting evidence, arguing his case. But here's what makes this so heartbreaking. These are 2 men who accomplished something extraordinary. They flew an impossible mission and changed the course of history. They should be brothers, bonded by shared experience. Instead, they become enemies consumed by the question of who deserves credit for killing a man neither of them wanted to fight in the first place. The dispute escalates. Depositions are taken, witnesses are interviewed, radar records are examined, flight paths are reconstructed. It becomes a legal case, an historical investigation, an obsession. Other pilots from the mission try to mediate. Mitchell himself attempts to settle the dispute, but by now it's beyond reason. It's become about honor, about truth, about two men who've staked their entire identities on those 15 minutes over Bougainville. In 1985, aviation historian Carol Glines publishes Attack on Yamamoto, meticulously researching the mission. His conclusion? Rex Barber fired the fatal shots that destroyed Admiral Yamamoto's bomber. Lanfear is furious. He threatens lawsuits. He writes angry rebuttals. He doubles down on his version of events. Then, in 1987, Tom Lanfear dies of a heart attack at age 68, still insisting he shot down Yamamoto, still fighting the battle that consumed his life. 4 years later, in 1991, the U.S. Air Force conducts an official investigation. They examine all available evidence, witness statements, gun camera footage, aircraft damage reports, Japanese records from the crash site. Their conclusion is definitive. Captain Rex T. Barber fired the shots that destroyed Admiral Yamamoto's bomber. Tom Lanfear engaged Japanese fighters and shot down a different aircraft, the second Betty bomber carrying Admiral Ugaki. Lanfear is posthumously removed from the list of American aces. His kill count drops from 5 to 4. Rex Barber receives official recognition as the killer of Yamamoto. He's 73 years old. He spent 48 years knowing the truth and watching someone else receive the glory. Does it bring him peace? Not really. By this point, the whole thing has been poisoned. The accomplishment is tainted by decades of argument and bitterness. Barber dies in 2001 at age 81, finally recognized as the killer of Yamamoto, but robbed of decades of acknowledgement. This is what war does. This is the cost that extends beyond the battlefield. Two young men who flew an impossible mission and accomplished the impossible, destroyed not by enemy fire, but by the question of who gets the credit. But there's another man whose life was destroyed by those 15 minutes. A man whose fate might be the saddest part of this entire story.
Admiral Matome Ugaki survived the ditching of his Betty bomber. He floated in the Pacific for hours before being rescued, his body broken, his spirit shattered. He'd witnessed his closest friend's death. He'd seen Yamamoto's bomber spiral into the jungle, and he'd survived when his commander died. In Japanese military culture of 1943, this was unbearable. Bushido, the warrior code, demanded that a subordinate die before his commander, that a chief of staff protect his admiral with his own life. Ugaki had failed in this most fundamental duty. He writes in his diary, "I should have died with him. I failed in my most sacred responsibility." The Imperial Japanese Navy gives Ugaki command of the battleship Yamato, then command of the 5th Air Fleet. But these commands feel hollow. He's going through the motions, waiting for an honorable death that keeps eluding him. By August 1945, Japan is collapsing. American bombers burn Japanese cities to ash. The Soviet Union has entered the war. Atomic bombs have devastated Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Emperor Hirohito himself announces Japan's surrender on August 15th. The war is over. Except for Admiral Ugaki, the war will never be over. On August 15th, hours after the Emperor's broadcast, Ugaki makes his decision. He orders preparations for one final kamikaze mission. His staff begs him to reconsider. The war is finished. There's no point in dying now. But Ugaki isn't trying to win the war. He's trying to join his commander. He climbs into a Yokosuka D-4Y dive bomber at Oita Air Base, wearing his dress uniform, carrying Yamamoto's photograph. 5 other aircraft join him, though there's only enough room for 3 pilots. His subordinates are so eager to die with their admiral that they fight over the remaining seats. Ugaki's final message is recorded. "I am going to proceed to Okinawa, where our men lost their lives like cherry blossoms. There, I will crash into the enemy positions and die with them." The formation takes off at 4:30 p.m., flying south toward Okinawa. American radar tracks them. American fighters are scrambled. But Ugaki doesn't engage. He's not trying to attack. He's trying to die. At approximately 7 p.m. on August 15, 1945, Admiral Motoli Ugaki's aircraft is shot down off the coast of Okinawa. He's 55 years old. He's been trying to die for 2 years and 4 months. He becomes the last kamikaze pilot of World War II, the final death of a conflict that killed millions. And he dies still trying to join the commander he lost over Bougainville on April 18, 1943. Think about that. Admiral Ugaki spent the last 28 months of his life consumed by the guilt of surviving. He fought at Leyte Gulf, commanded kamikaze operations, watched his country burn, and through it all, he was just waiting for permission to die. Those 15 minutes over Bougainville didn't just kill Yamamoto. They killed Ugaki too, just on a slower timeline. Let me tell you what this story is really about, and it's not what you think. This isn't a story about American military excellence, though the navigation feat alone was extraordinary. This isn't a story about revenge for Pearl Harbor, though that's how it was sold to the American public. This isn't even really a story about killing Japan's greatest admiral, though that's what happened. This is a story about the cost of duty, about what happens when honor demands you destroy yourself, about the way war poisons everything it touches, even victory. Let's start with Yamamoto. Here's a man who studied at Harvard, who toured American oil fields and understood their industrial capacity, who warned his government that war with America would end in disaster, who privately knew Japan couldn't win. And yet, when ordered to plan the attack on Pearl Harbor, he planned it brilliantly. When told to execute the strategy he believed would doom his country, he executed it flawlessly, because duty demanded it, because the code of Bushido left no room for dissent, because in his worldview, loyalty to the emperor trumped personal conviction. So he created the masterpiece that destroyed his nation. He became the architect of his own country's defeat. And on April 18, 1943, 16 months after Pearl Harbor, well within his predicted 6 months or a year timeline, American bullets found him at 6,500 feet over Bougainville. Yamamoto died clutching his samurai sword, still bound by the code that forced him to fight a war he knew was unwinnable. That's not heroic. That's tragic. That's a brilliant mind sacrificed to a system that valued obedience over wisdom.
Now consider the American pilots. Tom Landfear and Rex Barber were 24 and 23 years old. College kids, basically. They volunteered to fly an impossible mission without even knowing what the target was. They navigated 435 miles with 1943 technology. They fought against elite Japanese pilots. They accomplished what should have been impossible. And it destroyed them. Not the mission itself, not the combat, the aftermath, the question of who deserves credit, the argument that consumed 48 years.
Two men who should have been brothers, united by shared experience, instead became enemies. Their accomplishment was poisoned by pride and honor and the need for recognition. Lanfear spent his entire adult life telling his story, defending his claim, fighting to preserve his version of events. He died still arguing, still insisting, still consumed by those 15 minutes. Barber spent 48 years knowing the truth and watching someone else receive the glory. When he finally got official recognition, he was 73 years old. Too late to matter. Too late to heal the damage. The mission succeeded. History was changed. And it broke both men anyway. Then there's Admiral Ugaki, the survivor, the witness, the man who spent 28 months trying to join his commander in death because survival felt like betrayal, who finally found his honorable end by deliberately flying into American guns after the war had already ended. His death accomplished nothing, changed nothing, mattered to no one except himself. But the code demanded it, honor demanded it. So he died, the last kamikaze of World War II, still trying to fulfill a duty from April 18, 1943. Here's why this story matters in 2025. Here's why you should care about 15 minutes of aerial combat from 82 years ago. Because we're still doing this. We're still sacrificing individuals to systems. We're still letting codes and doctrines and honor traditions destroy people who dare to question them. We're still creating situations where brilliant minds know the right answer, but duty demands they execute the wrong one. Yamamoto knew Japan couldn't win. He said so explicitly. He'd studied America, understood their capacity, run the numbers. But the system didn't care. The code of Bushido didn't care. The emperor's government had decided on war, so he planned Pearl Harbor anyway. How many Yamamotos exist today? How many brilliant military leaders, corporate executives, political advisors know their orders will lead to disaster, but execute them anyway because dissent isn't culturally acceptable? How many catastrophes could be prevented if we built systems that valued wisdom over obedience? Look at Lanfear and Barber, two men who accomplished something extraordinary, then spent 5 decades fighting over who deserves credit. Think about what they could have accomplished if they'd channeled that energy differently. Think about the brotherhood they could have shared. Think about the next generation of pilots they could have mentored together. Instead, they got bitterness, lawsuits, and poisoned memories. Because our culture treats heroism like a zero-sum game. Because we think someone has to be the hero, rather than recognizing that 18 pilots flew that mission, 14 survived, and every single one of them was necessary for success. We're still doing this. We still fight over credit. We still create competitive environments where cooperation would serve everyone better. We still damage relationships over recognition and ego and the need to be the one. And Ugaki? His story might be the most important of all, because he shows us what happens when loyalty becomes pathological, when duty becomes suicide, when honor becomes the inability to adapt or accept or move forward. The war ended. Emperor Hirohito himself announced surrender. Japan was rebuilding. Life was continuing. But Ugaki couldn't move on because the code said survivors had dishonored themselves by surviving. So he died for no reason except to satisfy an abstract concept of honor that benefited no one. How many people today are trapped in similar patterns, staying in toxic jobs because loyalty to the company demands it, maintaining destructive relationships because commitment means never giving up, following career paths that make them miserable because family honor requires it, refusing to adapt or change because the code says you must be consistent even when circumstances change? Ugaki could have helped rebuild Japan, could have mentored the next generation,
could have used his experience to prevent future wars. Instead, he flew into American guns because survival felt like dishonor. That's not loyalty. That's waste. Let me tell you what Operation Vengeance really teaches us. Wars are fought by people, individual human beings with names and faces and families and doubts, not by nations or ideologies or flags, by people.
Admiral Yamamoto was a person, a brilliant strategist who loved poker and wrote poetry to his mistress. A man who desperately didn't want this war, but planned it anyway because duty demanded it. A grandfather figure. He was 59, old enough to be these American pilots' grandfather, who died clutching a samurai sword because the code said that's how a warrior dies. Tom Lanfear was a person, a 24-year-old kid who flew an impossible mission and accomplished something extraordinary, who then spent the rest of his life fighting to preserve his version of those 15 minutes, who died still arguing, still insisting, still unable to let go. Rex Barber was a person, a 23-year-old kid who took 104 bullet holes and walked away, who knew what happened but stayed quiet for decades because that's what professionals did, who finally got his recognition 48 years later when it no longer mattered. Admiral Ugaki was a person, a loyal subordinate who watched his commander die and spent 28 months trying to join him, who became the last kamikaze, not because it would change anything, but because the code said survival was dishonor. These aren't villains and heroes. These are people, trapped in systems that demanded they destroy themselves in different ways. Yamamoto by his duty, Lanfear and Barber by their egos, Ugaki by his loyalty. And here's the truly uncomfortable truth. All of them were brave. All of them were skilled. All of them were, by the standards of their cultures, honorable. Yamamoto knew the war was unwinnable, but planned the attack that started it. That's duty. The American pilots flew an impossible mission with fuel margins measured in minutes. That's courage. Ugaki spent his final months trying to die with his commander. That's loyalty. But bravery without wisdom is just waste. Skill without judgment is just destruction. Honor without compassion is just cruelty, even when it's self-directed. Let me leave you with this. There's a museum in Tokyo that houses Admiral Yamamoto's personal effects, his uniform, his medals, the samurai sword he was clutching when American bullets found him over Bougainville. The sword is over 400 years old, passed down through his family for generations. It survived wars and revolutions and the modernization of Japan. It survived everything, until it didn't. Japanese searchers found Yamamoto's body on April 19, 1943, thrown from the wreckage but still strapped to his seat. In his right hand, that ancestral sword. His grip was so tight they had to pry his fingers loose. The sword is on display now, behind glass, in climate-controlled conditions. Thousands of tourists photograph it every year. Most don't know the full story. They see a samurai sword, they see a connection to Japan's martial history, they take their photo and move on. But that sword represents everything tragic about this story. It's a symbol of honor, duty, loyalty, all the virtues that Yamamoto died upholding.
It's also a symbol of a code so rigid it forced brilliant men to destroy themselves and their nations rather than adapt to reality. Yamamoto clutched that sword even in death because the code demanded it. The same code that forced him to plan a war he knew would fail. The same code that prevented him from using his authority and credibility to advocate for peace. The same code that turned one of the century's most brilliant naval strategists into the architect of his own nation's defeat. And on the American side, there's no museum display, no sword to photograph, just two men who spent 5 decades fighting for credit for those 15 minutes, just a generation of pilots who accomplished the impossible and then watched their accomplishment poison the relationships that made it possible. The P-38 Lightning that Rex Barber flew, tail number 122, the one with 104 bullet holes, was scrapped for parts in 1945, melted down and turned into something else. No preservation, no museum display, no recognition. Maybe that's fitting. Maybe some missions shouldn't be celebrated. Maybe some victories are so costly that commemoration feels wrong. If this story moved you, if it made you think about duty and honor and the cost of victory differently, that's exactly what I hoped for. Because these lessons aren't historical abstractions, they're deeply relevant to how we live today. Question the systems that demand you sacrifice yourself, whether it's corporate culture, military tradition, family expectations, or social codes. If the system is destroying you, the system is wrong. Yamamoto knew Japan couldn't win, but followed orders anyway. Don't be Yamamoto. Share credit. Accomplishments are usually collective, even when culture wants to identify the hero. Lanfear and Barber could have been brothers. Instead, they became enemies over something that required both them and 16 other pilots to succeed. Don't be Lanfear or Barber. Know when to let go. Ugaki spent 28 months trying to die for an abstract concept of honor that benefited no one. Loyalty is valuable, but life is more valuable. The ability to adapt, to change, to accept new realities, that's not dishonor, that's wisdom. Don't be Ugaki. Wars are fought by people, individual human beings with doubts and fears and families. Before you support any conflict, remember that. Remember that on both sides there are probably people like Yamamoto, brilliant minds who know the war is wrong but are trapped in systems that don't value wisdom over obedience. Remember that victory often costs more than we calculate. April 18, 1943 was celebrated as one of the great triumphs of the Pacific War, and it was. But it also destroyed Ugaki, consumed Lanfear and Barber, and killed a man who never wanted the war in the first place. If you want to see more stories like this, the human truth behind historical events, the uncomfortable questions that challenge simple narratives, make sure you're subscribed. Hit that notification bell. These stories matter because they show us patterns we're still repeating today. And maybe, just maybe, if we understand the cost of those patterns, we'll make different choices. The comment section is open. I want to know, does questioning orders make you disloyal? Should Yamamoto have refused to plan Pearl Harbor? Could Lanfear and Barber have avoided their 5-decade argument? Should Ugaki have chosen to live and rebuild rather than die for honor? These aren't simple questions. That's why they matter. April 18, 1943. 15 minutes over Bougainville. 18 young Americans, a 59-year-old Japanese admiral, and the course of World War II changed forever. Everyone involved did their duty. Everyone was brave. Everyone followed their code. And almost everyone involved was destroyed by it. Remember that the next time someone tells you duty demands sacrifice. Ask what's being sacrificed and whether the code demanding it is still worth following. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is question the orders. Sometimes wisdom means recognizing when honor has become pathology. Admiral Yamamoto knew this war would fail. He flew that route anyway because duty demanded it. He died clutching a 400-year-old sword, symbol of a code that valued obedience over survival. The sword is in a museum now. Beautiful, historic, useless. Much like the systems that killed everyone in this story.